Okay, welcome back from break. Hopefully, you guys had good discussion in your small groups about your preseason preparations. We'll get back to that here in about an hour or so. But next, we're going to turn to risk management with Heath. So I'll let Heath introduce himself.
Well, I got to come off audio. It's one of my plagues with Zoom and Teams here. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you all had a productive lunch. My name is Heath Bell. I'm the Risk Management Officer for the Southern region. And as you might notice that Matt Holmstrom's listed on the agenda, but as our jobs are these days, he got multitasked, and so I'm happy to cover down for him and give his presentation or give the presentation I can. So good news is I was prepped and ready to go into the Southern Region's M581. So I think that you all kind of get some good information and some good pieces off of it. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen right now. And as we kind of go through this piece, I'm going to try to make it as interactive as possible, realizing that when I start to share my screen, I'm not going to be able to see a lot of you that are out there. But if you have questions as we're going through or something to add, please drop in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. However, the best method is to work there. And cadre and coaches, if you all see something that's kind of coming up in the queues, please stop and let me know. I like it when the dialogue goes back and forth. I think that's the best way for some of this communication to go forward. So sharing my screen here, let's see if we can get that up and give it a second if somebody will let me know when it does come up.
We got it.
Okay. So I had the fortune to sit through a good conversation last week that gave me a pretty good history of how risk management kind of really began in the Forest Service. And I think it's an important story for a lot of folks to know. As we kind of move through, there's a lot of requirements, a lot of OSHA requirements, a lot of OWL requirements, like a lot of things that are out there that require us to have safety systems in place as we go through our work. But what started kind of happening in the mid 90s with some large fatality fires is that we realized there needed to be a breakout specifically for fires. Not every occupational manager there can really justify or understand what's happening with fires. So they started to break out into what was originally called ground risk or ground safety, with some aviation counterparts and trying to understand and kind of make sense and put some of these processes in place along the safety realm. As we kind of went through the 90s and the 2000s stuff, Lessons Learned Center was stood up. We started doing FLAs. We started taking like a different look and a different approach really on how we were looking at safety. And we started working into this risk management portion and process to it. So starting about 2015 or so, there started to be an actual formation for operational risk management, which confuses some people as it's kind of denoted that way. But through that effort is we were able to kind of start to coalesce and get all of our ducks in a row so we could move forward up to this point that we are continuously moving through risk management, through the processes. And some of the pieces I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation is the ISAP process that was born from some of the risk management principles and processes. So going into that, this is some of the objectives we're going to try to cover today. For those of you who've taken Risk 101, I realize there's a number of agency administrators that are in the audience today or in the class. And this is a requirement for WFA3 as well as RXA3 that Risk 101 is taken. And so some of you may have seen some of these pieces before. I still think it's a great place to step off. We're going to talk about some of the risk management principles. We're going to talk about some of the human factors, communication with risk, the process. And then I'm going to go ahead and close it out for that portion on essentially a condensed version of the Risk 101. And then we're going to talk a little bit about ISAP. So jumping into this portion right here, how many of you all have heard the term, drive safe or, make safe decisions and whatever the case is, keep your family safe that's the idea, right? When people say stay safe, the idea is to be free from harm. Can we all agree with that? Anybody give me a thumbs up in the reactions or anything like that? Okay, I'm going to assume we're getting some thumbs up in there. But if you kind of dig into it a little bit more, that word safe comes from some Latin, some deeper pieces on it. This just means secure and free from danger. as we walk into more complex systems like wildfire systems or even some of your daily things you're doing, they're more complex. You can't just say be safe. You can't say just do these things. We realize that there's a level, there's a gradient that comes through, and with that comes a risk, right? And this is one of the most important definitions right here, is that risk equals uncertainty. And we're going to dive into it a little bit more here in a second. But really, you've got a consequence, you've got a probability, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. Like that's it. That's the risk. You know, as you kind of put your mental math onto it, you know, the consequence is going to be pretty harsh. The probability it's going to happen is going to be pretty high. Then that's higher risk, right? You can start to do the math and you can start to work into it. Versus things in like organic or static systems, such as like say running a drill press, right? If I have to go in and run a drill press, there's a set things of order. I've got to put my glasses, my PPE on, I've got to plug it in, I've got to have all the things on to do it, and it's rinse, lather, and repeat, right? Versus I need to go put fire line in over here. That's a dynamic situation that's always changing, and you can't just put the static into it. So rather that unknown, we're trying to use tools and communication to walk into that risk versus safety attitude. So those are some of the big pieces. Now, all of this is kind of anchored into the Red Book Chapter 7 for the current Red Book that's out there. And if y'all want to look at it later, it's got some good information. But there's also an operational risk management guide that's going under revision right now, but it's got a lot of these terms and pieces. And again, as I mentioned on the learning portal, there's the Risk 101 that I think has done a bang up job and gets people through there pretty quick. So let's go into some of this terminology. What are some of the words, some of the pieces that we kind of walk around when we talk about risk? I've already mentioned kind of a couple of them. Safety and risk are two definitions that are right out there on the board, right? But what are some other definitions or terms that we need to kind of walk in for definitions? In the chat, anybody?
Risk management.
So risk management, yeah. What does that actually mean, right? You mentioned a couple others like consequence, severity, probability, those types of things, right? One that's kind of coming back up to float here, mitigation. Yeah, that's a good one, Eric, for sure. Any other ideas kind of wrapping around it? And there's no right or wrong answer for what we're going to define here. And I'm not going to go through all the pieces in Risk 101. But we are going to talk about a few so we can all be on the same board for what that looks like. So instead of saying risk management, which I do appreciate, let's just talk about risk, right? Like we said, it's the uncertainty on the objectives. Like what is going on out there? We're gonna have to make a decision, a strategic action, and it's going to have to go through no risk, low risk, high risk, right? You're using your mental math and some of these tools we're going to provide here to start to walk in what that risk management looks like. Does that kind of jive and make sense for folks? I got a lot of black screens, so I'm just assuming that's a head nod for yes. All right, hazard. How many people have read this before? On any job hazard analysis, virtually any job you're supposed to do in the Forest Service, there's supposed to be a job hazard analysis or a risk assessment completed on doing those objectives, doing those tasks, right? So that hazard, anything that can happen out there, right? If this is infrastructure, if this is equipment, whatever the case might be, that potential condition that can happen to whatever that object is, right? The hazard might be, any of these, like, lightning. How many people die by lightning a year? Go ahead and, let's actually kind of walk through that for a second. Let's kind of go through these pieces and realizing that this slide is a little bit outdated, so the 2024 numbers may be a little bit different, but just kind of take a quick look at them. How many people do you think die by lightning hazard, shoveling snow hazard, all of these pieces? Just kind of look at them for a second, okay? And we're going to come back to them in just a second as we kind of go through this next piece. The severity and its consequence are kind of two pieces that really kind of work off of each other, right? If we kind of look at this as a matrix, which we're going to see later, then you can draw your severity and your consequence to come into a 5x5 grid on how high that hazard is, right? But we have to understand the severity is how bad is it going to be, all right? Or the magnitude, the consequence, right? Consequence is the outcome after the incident, all right? That kind of that hindsight consequence, not how bad can it be, but how bad will the consequence be? If that kind of makes sense, right? All right, here's the numbers off of some of the pieces we were talking about before. So the probability of getting struck by lightning, 50 people die by lightning a year versus 100 people dying by shoveling snow. There's a higher probability of dying getting shoveling snow than getting struck by lightning. There's an equal possibility that you can die by quicksand or lightning if we're looking at the probability and the statistics, right? But when you look at it, like immediately some of those biases come out, you're thinking like sharks. Of course, sharks are going to kill more people than vending machines, but it doesn't really work out that way for what those probabilities are. It's the chance of those consequences occurring. Exposure. So talking about exposure, this is a piece that we kind of want to be careful when we walk into because it's very critical. And a lot of our leadership looks at this exposure piece is like how many people are underneath that hazard tree, right? That hazard tree is a hazard. There's a potential that's going to come down. That is the hazard, all right? The task is to go cut that tree down, right? Or to walk underneath it. Let's kind of use that, whatever that example is. You're on the side of the hill and there's a hazard tree that's out there, and that is the hazard. But if you get one person right there, that's one person that's exposed to it for whatever the time takes to cut it down or to walk by. You've got an entire crew going by it, right? That's 20 people that are going by. They're exposed to that hazard each individually. That hazard doesn't change. The consequence severity probability doesn't change from the hazard, but the number of people that have been exposed to it does change over that time-weighted average. So you kind of walk into that, you just, be sure that we're using that term correctly so we can describe it, because ultimately that hazard tree is still a hazard. When you have one fatality, one mishap underneath it, there's still the hazard, there's still the tree that's out there. Sliding down on my slides here a little bit. All right, so we're going to kind of stop there. I want to pause and make sure there's no questions, that I just blew through some of the basic terminology. Now, if you go into ISO 3000 or whatever it is, 3000, then you can see there's a lot more definitions associated with it. If you look at the operational risk management guide, same deal. There's a lot more definitions and nomenclature and pieces that are around it. That was just like a big kind of overview so that we're all on the same page going into some of these other conversations coming into it. So I'm going to give it a 10-second lateral here, just to see that everybody's on the same page. Any questions? Not seeing any. I think that was 10. All right, now we're going to jump down into some risk management principles. There's essentially 4 principles that are coming out of the risk management. Now, for the smart folks that went into the room and kind of came up with these, I really stand by them because it kind of makes sense on a principle stage-by-stage basis, right? As you can read them, I won't read through them up there on the screen because we're going to talk about them a little bit more here in depth, but you can see that this all makes sense, right? Like, well, I guess I will read through them, except no unnecessary risk. We shouldn't have to explain that, right? And sometimes there's necessary risk out there, depending on the critical values of risk that we're going to have to face. That's an inherent part of the job, is facing some of that risk. But there's pieces that we don't have to do, that we don't have to put into it. We want to have that honest conversation, right? And then we come in that second spot. We know that there's going to be that risk. We're going to have that conversation. Is the juice worth the squeeze? You know, is it going to weigh out to be able to do those actions to complete the task? Is it worth that risk, right? And then number 3, make decisions at the appropriate level. Like, not every decision needs to be made by an agency administrator. That's a strategic level, and sometimes even enterprise level. We're coming back down into operational risk management and real-time risk management. So at those 2 levels, what is that risk that you're making, right? If you don't feel comfortable cutting that tree, you're underneath that tree by yourself. It's your decision, your conversation. You're responsible for mitigating those pieces and having that conversation with your supervisor. You don't have to take that all the way up to a type 1 IC when you're coming through that, right? You want to make those decisions at the appropriate level. Likewise, I don't want to, put on a task force leader having to go to public meetings and talking about, some of the critical values that are a risk out there, potential evacuations and evacuation times and that type of thing, right? That's not the appropriate level to be putting that on. So make sure that we're making those conversations and have those decisions at the appropriate level. And then the last one, which really, again, gonna throw it back to ISAP a little bit, is manage that risk by planning. Like if we can talk about it and we can kind of work it out there, you're going to be so much further ahead of the curve coming into to our process, to our tasks, our objectives. All right, who can give me a good kind of definition on human factors?
I think one would be like their skill level.
Mm-hmm. Skill level is one for sure. Experience, you might even say kind of along that line, right?
Fatigue.
Fatigue, yeah, that's a human factor.
Attitude.
I know that's a huge one, right? And along with that attitude comes in some biases that we're going to talk about a little bit later, right?
Cultural norms, maybe.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm going to try to walk in a little bit of a scenario here for you guys. And this is one that someone was handed to me a while ago, and I think it's one of the better examples when talking about human factors and examining a risk decision, right? So forgive me for kind of reading some of the script here, but it's the best way to get through it. So 2 years ago, dozens of AAs entered into a contest to find out whose organization could perform the best. Series of competitions were held with rules and engagement that tiered from agency goals, priorities, and targets. Strategic and operational authority was delegated to ICs, who led their respective teams during competitions. After several months, 2 teams rose to the top and were scheduled to face off for the final competition. Both ICs were highly experienced, successful, and had equally matched teams. For a lot of stake, reputations, careers, implications, money, most importantly, the well-being of those under their command. Risk decisions would be a critical role. All right, does it sound pretty trippy, pretty engaged right now? Well, here we go. This is kind of one of the best metaphors kind of coming into some of the risk management here. Who remembers this game? Anybody? On the left is Pete Carroll, Seattle Seahawks. They were 12-4 that year, #1 in the NFC. On the right, Bill Belichick, New England Patriots, 12-4, #1 seed in the AFC. That's right, we're going into the Super Bowl, right? So on the Seahawks side, this year they had quarterback Russell Wilson, excellent quarterback, and they also had Marshawn Lynch in beast mode, 5-time Pro Bowler. He was leading the league that year. Oh, sorry. Yep. Apologize.
There we go. I was like,
There
we're
we-
not seeing your left and right.
Yep, I clicked on the other slide on my right. Okay. Now is everybody paying attention? Kind of catch back up there to with what Belichick had for him. He had Tom Brady, Ron Gronkowski, Julian Edelman, and his defense was 8th in the NFL with points allowed. Who saw this game? A number of people. Who was surprised by the call of this game? Right? Yeah, again, a number of people. It was pretty crazy, right? Well, was it a bad call? Was it a bad decision, or was it a bad outcome? Right? Let's look at that for a second. Okay, so here's what we've got going on. 26 seconds left, 24-28, right? Seahawks are on the ball. They're on the 1-yard line, second down with timeout with one timeout remaining. So what would you do? I'm gonna run a poll here real quick. Put your answers in the chat. What would you do? You're gonna run it, throw it, run beast mode. I mean, yeah, Marshawn Lynch is like the best running back that year in the league, right? Russell Wilson was a top quarterback. Yeah, it makes sense to kind of run it, right? Well, let's watch this kind of play out. For those of you who did not get to see it, let's go ahead and get it going. Yep.
Butler, a rookie free agent
out of West Alabama. I'll go ahead and cut it short a little bit on the video there, but these were the headlines the next day, right? And as I can kind of see from the chat there, it's like a bunch of us are saying run it, right? Again, Marshawn Lynch, it makes sense to run it. It's called the worst call in Super Bowl history. All these bad things are coming out from these biases. Coach's terrible Super Bowl mistake. But hold on, let's think this through for just a second. All right. If we actually look at what was going on, was this a bad decision or was it a bad outcome? Like here's some of the stats for that year, right? The Butler's interception, he was low, like 109 pass attempts. Like who saw that coming, right? Previous 57 seasons, 2%. Marshawn Lynch in the last 1 in 5 carries, it was at 20% to go from the 1 yard line to a touchdown. Clock management, what is the defense thinking? All right, we've got all these things that are kind of based off of that. Was it a bad decision or a bad outcome? These the stats right here are telling me the better choice was to throw it. That was a lower risk than trying to run it versus what we know now. Y'all kind of see what we're going with? Give me a thumbs up if you kind of see what we're talking about bad choices and bad outcomes. Got a few people. Give me some thumbs up. All right, and that's kind of some of the purpose, some of the process of going in with risk dialogue, with risk management, risk informed conversations, is trying to use those stats, those analytics, those pieces, those tools, that conversation, anything we can use to reduce that risk, right? Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is wild on fire, right? That it's an inherently dangerous job. There is risk associated with damn near everything that we do. And so along those lines is that we need to be able to have that conversation, have those pieces off of it, but don't judge going through this process off of that decision or that outcome, right? It's that conversation walking into it to try to put us in the best place possible. Okay, let me move on a little bit more here, kind of past the football scheme. Who's heard of cognitive biases before? Brian, I appreciate your engagement, sir. Can I get a few more thumbs up? Anybody else? All right, a few people out there. Okay, we all have biases, right? Like that's just kind of, built into us with some heuristics and shortcuts and everything else. But they govern and control kind of our thoughts and our behaviors, including our decisions, right? You had kind of heard that term, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, y'all know what I'm saying with that term, right? Is that those are some of the biases coming into it. It's a pattern, it's a deviation from normal or rational judgment that that's just inherently kind of part of your experience, your slide deck, as we kind of call it, right? You can kind of start to create your own subject reality if you're kind of coming down these biases. And now there's all sorts of courses and classes out there covering cognitive biases, but some of the things that really stick out to me is like that outcome bias, right? That hindsight bias is that we made a decision, we walked into it with all this information, we had the conversations, and unintended outcomes still came from it, right? Well, when I come into that next thing, very similar thing, I'm gonna have that same deal. It's like, you know what? We're going through the process, we're doing all the right things, but I know the outcome on that last one really jaded me from making that decision. Should that mean that we change how we do our risk management process at all? Anybody? I mean, I'm just going to say it right now, it should be no, right? Like we want to go through the process, and we're going to talk about what that process looks like here in just a second. Want to talk about system 1, system 2 thinking a little bit here. This is kind of some newer stuff that's been thrown into risk management, but it's really kind of that important process to understanding how the human psyche works and making decisions, right? So system 1, This is like the number one part of your brain, right? It's subconscious. These are the things you're doing because you do it, right? It's like riding a bike. You jump on a bike, or you think you have to left pedal, right pedal, balance everything else. Your brain is learned that you can do all these things in the same fashion to be able to go through it for efficiency, right? It's a shortcut to make your brain work. All right. Is everybody following me with system one? System two is the part where we have to be analytical. We have to stop and we have to start to think about what we're doing and do these pieces and build it into it. And it takes a lot more slow, deliberate pace. The ultimate idea when it comes down to system one and system two thinking is to bring these principles and bring this action, this risk management back over into the system one category, right? But not do it in a fashion where it becomes autonomous, where it becomes just unimportant, right? Is we want to have those deliberate conversations and come into it, but we want to feel comfortable on knowing the process coming into it. So starting to balance from system one to system two. Anybody got any questions on that? Now, the impressive part off of this is that we do the slow all the time. Like, when I read, I have to sit there and kind of think about it. I can gloss over stuff pretty quick. I can gloss over policy pretty quick. But if I'm interested in a novel, like one of the favorite ones I'm reading right now is The Greatest Beer Run, my mind is engaged. I'm intentionally thinking how those pieces are going, right? But that versus like me watching TV or me switching that back over, that's just that autonomous piece kind of going through, right? And we switch back and forth all the time seamlessly, but we want to make sure that we're having deliberate conversations when it comes around risk management. Okay. Communicating risk. What are some of the ways, and I want to get about 5 answers up in the queue here in the chat, because we're kind of flying through some of these slides. What are some ways that we communicate risk, or that you communicate risk on fires and prescribed fires? Anybody? Briefings, IAPs. Oh, body language. That's an interesting one. JHAs. Yeah, those are all great engaged answers for sure. And yeah, those are all correct. Now the idea is how do we get into communicating that risk, right? And we're going to do the ISAP process here in just a second. I'm going to give you an overview, a general overview of what that looks like. But when it comes to communicating risk, want to talk about specifically these JHAs. I didn't see anybody, and I was going through the chat pretty quick there, but I didn't see anybody mention risk assessments. So what is the difference between a risk assessment and a JHA? And when would you use either of them? If anybody's brave enough to come on screen and talk about it.
I guess as a job hazard analysis is, I think that's like the first step is you're just going through whatever your work site is and you're identifying what the particular hazards are. And then the risk analysis, if I understand it correctly, is sort of the part 2 phase of after you've identified what hazards are, then you analyze the risk of those potential hazards.
Yeah, and I see where you're going with that, and that makes sense. It seems like it's a little bit it's the next process, stage in the process, right? And it can be, it for sure can be, but policy-wise, we should be able to use both the JHA and the RA dependently on kind of how it works, right? And I like what Nicholas said there is key to the conversation. You're absolutely right. Is that when we're looking at that JHA, we've been using for years. It's only been about the last 7 years the risk assessments have been coming into the system as being frequently used. But that JHAs, you take a look at the job, what are the hazards and what are the mitigations, right? And that's kind of how you walk away from it. So this is a very easy tool to use when it is something pretty static, something pretty simple, right? So again, I use the drill press as one of those pieces, right? Is it's pretty easy to know how to put the drill press down, and so we can walk through. We can know what those steps are on the JHA. But when things start to get a little bit messy, let's say like a complex tree, right? We're coming into a C3 that we need to go fall down. Now we're not in the simple anymore, right? Is that, yeah, you still got to do those pieces off the JHA, and if that's what you signed at the beginning of the year, and you reviewed it coming into this task and hazard, for sure. But if we're looking at that risk assessment, what's the complex levels off of that, right? And what is that probability and hazard, or probability and consequence that's going to happen for what your risk code is, right? Is it going to be high? Is it going to be low? And it gives you more of a dynamic feel on how to walk it through. So that's kind of more for a complex operation, but it doesn't mean that you can't use it for the drill press. Like, for sure you can, if that's what you're using on your unit, then keep doing it, keep doing a good job. But that's how I like to break the two of them out as far as we're looking at it. So and then, yeah, implementing controls. That's kind of the last piece off of both the JHA and RA is the controls, right? Or what are the mitigations? Like, how are we going to, deal with this hazard, this task, and this hazard that we have out here, right? Why I think a lot of folks, a lot of leaders like to look at the risk assessment instead, and this is kind of cheesy, but I believe it to be true, is it's color coded. Is all of a sudden now you've got green and yellow and red on there, where if a leader looks at that JHA and says, why is this red, even after all your mitigations, you can have that conversation with them. It's a way to draw it in to further get into that conversation to communicate that risk. The JHA doesn't really do that, right? It's got, your tasks and your hazards and your mitigations, but it doesn't really walk through those pieces on what that risk looks like. And Marlon, I really like where you're going with that, and that's actually going to be part of our process. And what is a risk assessment when we come through that in a little bit more. But to kind of, I want to kind of hit on a few more things as far as communicating risk, because again, I've thrown a lot back at ISAP. We're going to look at a little bit of their process today. But what are some things on a fire? The 215 that that you might see out there, right? A strategic risk assessment. That'd be one way to communicate that. But unless, like a lot of you said, unless that is being put forward into briefing, then it doesn't really communicate the risk, right? Is you need to kind of understand what that 215 looks like, what that risk assessment looks like, and you need to be able to have that conversation, have that dialogue. Some of the times when we're coming into this risk-informed decision making and this risk conversation, a lot of things that have been kind of regenerated lately is how to properly refuse risk, right? And again, we can go back to the IRPG and go through that. But if we're looking through that, we can use that risk assessment and we can use that piece out of the IRPG to have that conversation back to leadership, right? This isn't just a one way. It's not that safety officer coming down and saying, you have to do these things. Is while you're out in the field, you can say, hey, we learned this stuff, and it passes it back up the chain to be able to change that risk assessment for better or worse. Like that was a more hazardous situation than we thought, or it was less hazardous situation than we thought, and to communicate that. So that goes back and forth with that sender, receiver, and message, right? What are some other tools that we may have? And I'm talking about like actual tools, like things that like are palpable. I think I saw one up here from Lindsay, said safety message. Oh man, I love a good written safety message. I really, really do. They can be super effective, but they can also kind of get caught in that doldrum there as well, right? Kind of sticking around this risk portion off of it is I like to see a lot of those safety messages that they come in, they say, don't do this. I like them to have to kind of explain why not to do it, right? I want that back part of the story so I understand how to communicate to my folks what that conversation is, right? A safety message about like wear gloves, that's not really like a risk-informed dialogue, right? But if you were to say something like, hey, we're working around a lot of lechuguilla, thorns and pokey stuff out here. Your gloves can help give you PPE to keep those thorns and splinters out. That makes sense. That's the risk-informed dialogue that we're kind of going for. And that's just at a local level, right? That's at a real-time level, let alone going into more operational and strategic conversations. Has anybody heard of the risk communication or the risk app by the U.S. Forest Service? Does anybody have this on their phone? Oh, perfect. Brian, you get extra points, buddy. Yeah. I don't have the image brought up on this slide. I apologize, but this app is available for Android and Apple. You can get it on your government devices, and essentially it's another tool that I think is pretty impressive how to walk in that conversation. I've used it on several briefings for both prescribed fire and wildfire to kind of walk through those tools and pieces, and it was a very effective tool, I'm not saying that it replaces everything, but the conversation that I've had on small teams with that risk calculator app is a pretty kind of interesting piece to look at. Now, on that is that that's not our policy piece, right? Is that we have to fall back to our risk assessments and our JHAs as required by our individual agencies. But that app can be another tool to have that conversation. And the way that it was designed is that it doesn't save, it doesn't fold over. You can screen capture and send it to folks and stuff, but we intentionally had that conversation around that app not having that ability because we didn't want it to be a tool for a safety manager, somebody come in and say, hey, did you do your risk calculator app on there? Not everybody has access to it. But nonetheless, we wanted this information to get out. And some of the prompts that are in that app are pretty sweet and make a lot of sense. So what's another way that we can communicate risk? Another tool, a physical tool that oftentimes gets overlooked. I'm just going to throw it out there real quick and say a tailgate safety session, right? And the reason I put it in here, right, with the risk calculator is that risk calculator, even though we've got to document the tailgate safety session, is that risk calculator can help you have that conversation and walk through it. Is that there are two pieces that are really good to drop the back tailgate right there and have that conversation with your folks on a back and forth dialogue. All right, Zane, I saw you said safety pause up there again. Yeah, safety pause is a way to communicate, or at least like if a safety stand down and safety pause kind of happens, it indicates that something happens. A leader made a decision that we're not going to be on the fire on the line that day, right? But I think the communication as to why that safety stand down, that safety pause happens is more important. Be that in a safety briefing, be that in a bulletin or whatever the case might be, that it's important to get that through. Lorenz, AAR, yeah, awesome, man. That's a very good point. Also, is that after action review can be a great time and tool to communicate that risk backwards, right? Back up the chain. Is it's not just that one way. Is that, hey, when I saw this out here today, we saw X, Y, and Z. We could have mitigated this. We mitigated it that way. Whatever the case might be, the AAR is an excellent opportunity to communicate that forward. Awesome. All right. So now I'm going to jump into a risk assessment, and we're not going to go through the full-on risk assessment. I don't think that that'll necessarily be useful for this. I think that if you want to go see them that are available out there, talk with your local safety managers and risk management officers, and they can help you kind of look at what the risk assessments are. But I more wanted to talk about this overview of what that cycle looks like. Right now, with this circle here, I mean, all of us have seen the NEPA circle. All of us have probably seen some sort of version of this before, right? It's got 5 steps. It goes around. You make a decision. You come back, and it just kind of keeps going around. It's not a different process than the risk assessment that goes into it in the entire process, right? Identify your hazards, assess the hazards, make a risk decision, right? So again, we're going to use that hazard tree as an example. We've identified that thing could come over on the trail while people are hiking over there. All right. So that we've identified it, we've assessed it. Now we're gonna make the decision. What are we gonna do? We're gonna cut it down. We're gonna flag it off. What are we gonna do to mitigate that hazard, right? Which might include more actions, more hazards. Like we might have to go cut it. We might, reroute. Whatever the case might be, we're starting to implement those controls. Now, you'll notice right down here between step 3 and 4, though, is that this is a back and forth all the time, making the decision and implementing controls. Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? And that's back to that two-way communication from you all on the line back to whoever your supervisor is, and supervisors back down the line as well. Is that this is the back and forth dialogue like a IDT to understand what hazards are out there in real time and how we can mitigate them. As the controls are implemented, then we're going to supervise it, right? We're going to go ahead and make sure that they are actually working, that they are going back and forth. And then we're going to move on to the next one. We're going to start all over again, back to identify the hazards and go around the circle. So it's not overtly complex piece to look at. But what is important during this whole thing is this communication, evaluation, and validation, right? Trust but verify kind of type of stuff. Is that we want to communicate with our folks, again, up and down as we're seeing this risk. This isn't held in a container. This isn't like doctrinal secrets that we're working with here, is that we want folks out there to know what the risks are, have that honest conversation in an attempt to reduce any unintended outcomes that may be out there. So saying that, when we come into the risk assessment, which is the actual Excel spreadsheet or whatever kind of form that you're using, is we're going back into those severity and those consequences and the probability, like we were talking about before, some of those definitions, right? How bad is it going to be? What's the chance it's going to happen? We're running currently this 5x4 matrix inside the Forest Service, which tends to walk it in pretty clearly. That you know, it's pretty easy to see. If it's negligible and it's rare, then it's a low risk, right? If it's almost certain and something bad, really bad is going to happen, it's going to be extremely high, and then we walk into it. Now, here's the cautionary tale for that piece: is don't try to change your severity and probability around to try to get the risk that you want, right? You might actually come out and say the pieces are, you know, as possible, and it could kill somebody. That's extremely high. But you look at it and you're like, well, is it really that high? This is a classic mistake that folks make all the time. So then they start to kind of do the mental math. They're like, well, it's probably more unlikely to happen than possible. And that conversation comes down. Or it's not going to be as bad as an outcome, trying to bring it down. Don't do that. Leave the original conversation out there, pre-mitigation, for what it is. If it's extremely high and we need to put some mitigations in there to either not take action or to have additional PPE, additional people, additional experience, and et cetera, to reduce it, then we'll do that. But don't try to fudge it around mental math wise to bring it down. And then once your post mitigations there, having that conversation that it is an inherently dangerous job. Some of the stuff that we do can be very dangerous, and we need to ensure that we're having those conversations so that our folks know that. All right, any questions that way? All right, now, if I understand right, Eric, are you still up online here, sir?
Absolutely.
All right, so we're coming up on 45 here, a little bit early, and we wanted to take a break halfway through here. Is this a good time to do so, sir?
Yes, whatever works out well for your presentation. This is a good break spot. Let's go ahead and do it now.
I think this is a good break spot right now. Let's give it about 15 minutes. Well, let's give you a full 17 and a half minutes here. Let's come back to the top of the hour, and we're going to jump into some ISAP pieces and try to walk through those conversations. Be back in about 15. Top of the hour. Eric, can we jump into a breakout room real quick?
Yep. I'll
Okay.
see you over in the teacher lounge.
Okay. And the folks have made it back from your break. And now we're going to cover, as I promised, previous presentations, the ISAP process. So this process has a little bit of a history. It got into real full force this last year. It started getting rolling out in 2023. And so there's a kind of some bells and whistles that are coming up with it. And there's still a lot of the process is still going on. But here's the overall portion with ISAP, right? Is it's a risk tool to help communicate that between agency administrators and ICs and others on the line. Now, is a process. It's not the only process to use. But what we needed, as we kind of came in through this, is we needed a systematic tool that would allow folks to be able to communicate that risk from one team to the next team to the next team, if needed, as well as for that agency administrator and those ICs to have that communication, those pieces off of it, right? And so the NEMO folks who came up with it put a lot of information, a lot of risk dialogue around it. So a lot of the pieces we're going to hear from the ISAP process is some communication we were using from before. As we're going into this, I did drop the story map into the chat there. If you all want to go look at the page, there's some good tools and some good stuff that's over there. But I wanted to ask by reaction, like either thumbs up or a raise of hands, like who has gone through the ISAP process before? Who here is familiar with it or has heard of it? A few people. Okay. So of those who have gone through it, who found it a useful process? Is anybody brave enough to come on screen and talk about your experience with it? Donna, go ahead. Or Lisa,
Yeah.
either or for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I found it really helpful when when we're working with communities, we have limited resources. It's really helped us pull together with the local fire organizations, the sheriff, the emergency response groups, and really kind of set out a plan for what were our action management points, what was our strategic points. And in the one case that we did it, it was really helpful that we knew that we didn't have enough resources. And if the FS Pro came to run and worst case scenario happened, that we would be evacuating and doing point protection at the school and the hospital. And it was really helpful to have had that conversation in advance, to be in agreement. In that particular case, we didn't get to that point with the fire, but to have had those, we spent 2 days, we met at different times to really think our way through what are all the values at risk, and then what is it that we can protect in a really thoughtful way. I thought it was really a powerful exercise, and I'm a believer now.
Oh, I appreciate you sharing. Lisa, what about you?
Yeah, I used it quite a few times last summer, and I found it useful, but when I found it most effective was when it was on a smaller incident or on a portion of an incident. We were getting incidents that were in the 150 to 180,000 acres. And because you're only given 6 options for the critical values at risk, we ended up sort of diluting those to the point that it was kind of a generic risk assessment. But when we had to make some decisions on a portion of the line over what tactics we wanted to take, and we applied it there, it was incredibly effective. Really got to look at, the values, what we wanted to do, the strategies, the options that we had, the probability of success, the risks associated that, and that really helped inform the decision that we made to go out on the line. So very effective in a smaller setting, more informative, but maybe less effective at the really, really big scale.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying. We're going to touch on that just a little bit through this PowerPoint, I hope, and then you can take the message back to your other folks, because this is a process and it can be broken down. It can be adaptive as needed to go into the various different projects. So, so going into it, I already kind of mentioned some of the backstory, and I appreciate you both for jumping on and giving us that perspective from a leadership perspective, especially. But to come back into the backstory on here, essentially, yeah, in 2017, with a lot of stuff kind of going on and risk informed dialogue coming through, is the tasking was to find a process that's going to help folks come through. And so this ISAP process is a continuous piece kind of going forward. And it can be very effective if used right and diligently. The biggest piece to understand here also is at the end of the day, this risk conversation tool is between IC and the AA, right? The AA to have that information, agency administrators to know what they've got on the plate there and what the impacts are going to be for some of the pillars, some of the pieces going forward. So for the objectives here, and we're not going to delve too deep into it because this is not an ISAP lesson. We're not going to do an ISAP full exercise here. This is an understanding of what the ISAP process is. We're going to go over a number of these objectives here and just try to get you all to a point to understand when these come into your camp. If you are that FMO, that AA that's up on looking at one of these, some of those general pieces to walk into it to be able to have the conversation retroactively or proactively. So this is kind of, again, some of the moving forward, some of the pieces that a lot of the NEMO folks will come on and really take a lot of interaction on this. But again, I mentioned back between that AA and that IMT that this process is a holistic process, right? It's not just ops sitting down there. It's not just safety sitting down there. It's the AA and IMT and that transition, as we kind of saw it coming through, 2017 and later, like even before that, we were having multiple duration fires. I mean, how many fires have we been on where we've seen like 4 IMTs roll through it, right? And we're not even talking complexity. We're just talking about timing out that is happening more and more frequently. And what was happening in that process is what was seen is the team has to come in and start from zero. Felt like they had to go from zero and start building back up. The next team would come in, start from zero and building them back up. And that's a lot of back and forth. And for AAs and AA reps that are out there, that's a head game. That's a lot of kind of back and forth. So the idea was to kind of streamline this, get us all on the same page on a dialogue that we can all agree on, and move forward. So what is ISAP? What is the part of it? It's again, it's this a whole informed decision making. It's got all the pieces on it. We're going to talk about some pillars. We're going to talk about some levels, but it's a process. Again, not the process, but a process to be able to walk through it, right? I don't think I can play the recording here. Yeah, the recording that comes up on this one, and unfortunately it's kind of static on us, is essentially an AA on on the Pacosa Springs wildfire, talking about that aha moment that they had when they were kind of going through this this ISAP process, and there was some informed conversations. They were able to get their definitions out there, their critical values. They were able to see the pieces that needed to be out there right off the top for each strategic action they were looking at taking moving forward into it. So it was a kind of one of those pieces. Was kind of cool to watch the light bulb kind of click on as he was getting what the ISAP process meant. Again, just that alignment and communication and duration, right? Is we're going to see a lot more of it, and the chances are, you know, that we're all going to end up on a fire at some point running through this ISAP process. Now, from some of the conversation, this is from the School of Heath Bell here for a second, is that I too am a believer of the ISAP process. It is an excellent information tool to communicate risk in these processes going through it. Where we don't want to get is that this ISAP process becomes just another 215, another strategic safety assessment that we have to do, right? We want it to be that portion where we can communicate and continue to evaluate what the risks are out there in real time and have a plan to be able to transfer them forward, transfer the risks and not transfer the risk, but transfer the communication forward. We're going to talk about levels of risk management. I'd mentioned this a little bit earlier in the last presentation. But as far as it goes for the Forest Service policy, really, a lot of the risk management that we deal with, that we hear about, that we were talking about in that last presentation, is down here in real time and operational, right? That's that we're making decisions that are going to impact us right now. This ISAP is going to the next level higher to that strategy, right? To get to that strategic alignment on what we needed to kind of look for and how that's going to process out. Is what we're really trying to do here between all these is close that gap of uncertainty, right? That risk that we keep talking about, per definition, is between that enterprise and that real time to kind of close it so the firefighters know what the risks are out there. Agency administrators have the ability to make those decisions that are pertinent to the operations up and down the line and have the ability to have those fluid conversations. So for this conversation for the ISAP, again, we're at that strategic level. SRAs are part of strategic risk assessments. The ISAP being part of that, you're going to see SA, a strategic action that we're gonna dive into here in a little bit. And essentially back over to this last part, this risk ownership level. Again, those FMOs, those AAs are responsible, or those IMT reps. But it's not, again, just that one person's puppy that's in this whole thing. It's a team process that goes into it. There's a lot of information that helps feed into the ISAP process. Whoop. So with that, the team that came through working with the NEMO team and IMAC came up with these 4 pillars, these standing pieces that need to hold ISAP up, right? You can kind of just read through those, and we're going to go through them a little bit more in depth. But essentially, with using all those pillars, we want to be on the same level, same conversation, so that when we go from one ISAP process to the next, that they are familiar. Now, not every one of them is going to be exactly the same. It's going to change up as you kind of go, and it should. You know, there are different values at risk. You're going to have different players that are involved, as it's not a static piece there, but the communication, having these understandings going forward, is where we need to be on the same page. So, these are some of the resources, and again, off that link that's in the chat, if you go look at it, it's got some of them that are in there. The RMA website is another good place to go to check it out. But essentially, this is what that essay looks like as we kind of go into it. And these are, the pieces that kind of inform all the conversations, all of it coming back into this alignment process with the 4 pillars. So we're going to jump into a little bit more. All right. The critical values at risk. Oh, sorry, I'm jumped past that last page here. This is the page I was talking about. Apologize, it's kind of getting a little bit of a delay on me, but these are just some of the resources, the ISAP resources that we were talking about. What I do like on this slide, though, to kind of highlight in here on these green pieces, is you can see everybody on the team who has input coming into what these 6 pieces are for that responder risk. And then it goes up and down, right? That it's a comprehensive communication tool coming back and forth. All right. Critical values of risk, this conversation. I mean, we've all kind of heard this piece before, right? The idea is that when you start to look at that ISAP sheet, that it comes back into it. And we were talking about, again, that severity impact, that priority, that all these things that kind of come through to bring it into the conversation on what that rates out. So they're all listed, and they're listed on, the general notes, susceptibility notes. All these pieces are starting to paint a picture of what those critical values of risk are. Having sat in some of these meetings with interagency, it is really interesting to kind of look at what critical values are at risk kind of between state and private and local and government and all those pieces. When they have that conversation, is that they were just to throw everything at the board. There's a lot of stuff that gets put up there as a critical value at risk. When we start putting it on paper and start having the conversation and using the tools and start to build those pieces back into it, now we can kind of start to see how those things kind of pull out and rank out if you need to rank them out. But you can kind of start to see what those critical values at risk are. So off of this, again, when you kind of come into that Excel sheet, not walking through the entire process, but you've got all these strategic actions that are down at the bottom that are starting to build off of this sheet right here. This is like essentially, like you can see on the slide, strategic action 2, you can go into strategic action 3, but it's going to have these pieces that are built into it. Right here, what we're talking about with those critical values at risk, that's like kind of step 1 that's on there. And you're going to kind of see that as it kind of goes forward. This is what we're looking at, right? Is off that last slide, is getting laid back over into it for what these pieces are for the risk rating as it comes out. And it gives that visual right there. And again, it can be rated out. You can change them over if you need to, but essentially that, greens to reds pieces on there for that piece of understanding. And again, right there on that one sheet. As we come into pillar number 2, now we're talking about those strategic actions, right? This is that, like, I don't know how many folks have heard of pods, that, those point protections, those lines, those pieces that, not even DPAs and stuff, but that they're breaks, right? They're kind of predetermined breaks. That's a good piece to have in there. Pre-attack plans, this is a observation and a collective experience, like the folks that are on that unit know that when fire gets on that hill, that this is going to happen. We've seen it, and we need to be able to, express that, and go into those larger actions, right? Not just that tactical decision of getting folks on the line, but what does that strategy look like for getting the information up front? What's that bigger picture look like? It's moving away from those complicated tactics, more to the strategic alignment. We've all heard of the 5 R's: the right place, right time, right asset, right duration. I mean, it's all good. But to actually do that, that's what this pillar number 2 is making those 5 R's come into line, right? And, IC ops and safety usually tend to pick up on it pretty heavily in that communication back with the agency administrator. But as we're going to see, everybody on the team's got some pieces that need to go into it. It needs to be that comprehensive level. And it's going to help avoid some of those bad options as you come into that strategy, like have that honest conversation to be able to pass that along as we kind of time out it if that's where we're going. So coming down into this is a lot of those essays that we're talking about is going to be on the strat map, right? And it's pretty cool to kind of watch the evolution as this has kind of gone through, is to go in and start to see as these essays are put up on the map and as it makes sense. And kind of as we were talking about with Lisa there, putting 150,000 acre fire on that strat map and having all these pieces just kind of like directed onto it gets a little bit confusing. But we can break those up also. We can break it up into the wilderness. We can break it up into point protection. divisions, like whatever the case might be, there's nothing saying that we can't break the ISAP process down into those areas, those branches as needed to communicate all the information that's up there. And again, watch the evolution coming off of it. It puts everybody on that same page. I'm not going to go through a lot of these terms right here, right now. But what we do need to understand is that they do correlate back into the SRA and to the SA for what those conversations have. This risk discussion, these risk mitigations. That a lot of this information, this tool needs to be on the same page as we're going through. This is what a strategic action. This is a good example of it. On Division Echo, it's got your options that kind of walk through there. You can kind of read them yourselves, but this is what it's like. This is what it's looking like coming into the whole big piece. All functions again need to know what is saying off this, right? Logistics might be involved, medical for sure, safety, ops. Just everybody needs to be able to see what the strategic action is and how their pieces are related to it to be able to carry the plan out. Some of the analytics that are used to inform the strategy, we've all seen these before. We've all kind of come into it. And again, there's the RMA dashboard has a lot of these tools on there. A lot of the F-bands and stuff on Teams are really critical on a lot of the information coming through on it. These are the traditional pieces here on the left on analysis that will go into it that can definitely help out. The ones on the right are some of those RMA products that again can help inform that strategy going into it off of that pillar, right? Questions? I'm going to pause right there for a second because that was just a lot that I just dumped on all y'all. So just to kind of sum up where we're at with these pillars right now, with these first two, is there's a lot of tools that everybody needs to come together to come onto the same page to be able to make it transferable if it needs to go to the next team. So that's kind of the bottom takeaway with pillar 1 and 2 right at this point. Coming into the next pillar is this risk to responders, this risk influencer, right? And this is kind of a little bit of what I think Lisa was talking about with like the 6 options and the things that kind of come into it. But these are some common denominators that ISAP team, that NMAC team kind of put together to talk about what's going to happen, right? What are the potentials out there for those responders? And essentially, all of these are going to start to feed into that process. We'll see that page again in just a second. So again, on that SRA, you can see what the threat is to, or the risk to responders is coming into it. These are those influencers starting to have that conversation. Okay, now these ratings, yes, they can be subjective, even through our best data. That we just kind of need to understand and come back to it. Like I was telling you folks earlier, is that when we come in and we do our risk assessment, is that give it, like, use your experts, use your SMEs to have these conversations. What is the severity? What is the probability, right? If you feel like you don't have the expertise to answer that question, bring people in, bring your safety in, bring your ops in, bring whomever you need in to have that conversation and stick to it, right? If it rates out is extremely high, then it's extremely high. And that's a conversation that needs to make it back over here onto the this SA number 2, right? Kind of, I want to again pause there. Again, make sure we're not bending what we think it is for the risk rating. We want to go through the serious conversation of the severity and the probability to come up with that risk rating and let it lay there and put the mitigations in as needed. Okay, and again, coming back on that SRA, this block right here is that third pillar essentially, and we're going to see that a little bit later. All right, the last one we want to talk about is this probability of success. And this is a huge piece coming in back into the risk conversation, but I'm going to go ahead and play the video here. And I know sometimes that's a little bit hard when we do that across Zoom and Teams to play the video, but I feel like this is a better explanation that I want to walk through probability of success and kind of give myself a break from talking.
Keith, we can't hear the audio.
No? Okay, hold on one second. Let me see if I can adjust it on here at all.
Or maybe a little bit. Maybe it's just the volume, but
You know, it seems
No,
like
you won't be able to hear the volume unless when he shared his slides, he clicked share computer audio as well. So he would have to unshare and reshare and click that box.
Oh, okay, that's fair, Megan. And we're not going to go through that process. All right, let me just walk through probability of success here real quick. So essentially what we're coming down through is talking about when we come into the off sheet. This is the part that I thought was pretty important. Is you say, what is the probability of success? And typically off sheets on average will come over and say 80% successful. Well, what we actually know that to be wrong is that most fire lines strategic or historically only 35% of our fire lines hold fire. The other 65% they blow right by. So somewhere in between that 80% and that 35% is where we need to get to. We need to close that gap. So when we start talking probability of success, again, this is not just ops. This is not just the IC and AA. This is not, you know, in a container here. Is we want to bring folks back in to have that conversation to say what is actually happening here. How can we actually get a real probability of success for what this strategic action is going to entail. As Brad kind of talks about, you know, at length there, and I'll try to see if I can't grab the link here towards the end of my slide and put it in the video because he does a really good job talking about it. But it's kind of coming back into that comfort level and trying to not make it as subjective, trying to make it as objective as you can coming into these essays and these SRAs. So probability of success is what's the likelihood that our plan, that essay is going to work out in this condition, and that's where we want to be at. So now we're looking at the deliverables piece here. And I know we've been kind of bouncing it back and forth, and I've kind of been mentioning it kind of coming and going, but you can see that this page right here has all 4 pillars up into it. So like I was mentioning, and it's laid out, it's not, you know, rocket surgery to look at it, but pillar 1, pillar 2, you know, coming back into the strategy and the actions, those pieces that are up there for everybody to know. Pillar 3 coming down here, responder risk, you know, it's up on the page. And then as we come into this probability of success, is 70% portion right up here is for pillar 4. And that's that honest conversation, right? To have that piece come back into it to say, you know, we don't want to send our folks up on the line saying, yeah, 100% you got this. We want to be able to use this page to have that conversation. More so, we want to be able to take this page from team to team to be able to have that conversation. All right. And estimated cost. I'm not even going to touch estimated cost. That's a whole conversation for a different day. All right. How to incorporate this into the team process. Like I keep saying, like this is not just one person's role. How the larger person that's going to change on this one is that the team goes from one incident to another incident is likely going to be a different agency administrators coming back over to it. The conversations are going to be different. Even from version 1 to version 2, it's going to be different. The idea here, how to incorporate this in is by practice, right? Is to take your team, if you've got that team up there, is to give them a run off of it. Let them go through it. If your team is built up for the first of the year, like we're putting together the red and the blue teams right now in the Southern region, again, going through those processes and conversations on what my role looks like as we come up in the team meetings, is that we really want to get into that holistic approach that it's everybody. And it's the responsibility of the entire IMT to talk with the agency administrator using that ISAP process as a process to be able to communicate these risks that we've been talking about. Here's another kind of good note on this too, is that a lot of times we kind of think about this as like, you know, it's an SRA meeting or there's an ISAT meeting. That's not it. It's a process. This is all a strategy meeting, and strategy meetings happen with teams all the time, several times a day, right? And so with that, I mean, I know a number of us that have been on the teams before can look at this planning P, and this is the part of it, right? I kind of like to joke around here, but if we take out this a part of this meeting piece or this planning piece, is that it's no longer a planning P, it becomes a planning question mark. And so just realizing that this process is a process to use during strategy meetings, bring everybody on the same page, same alignment across a large, complex incident. All right, like we talked about a little bit earlier too, consistency. Different teams are gonna have different approaches. A different facilitator is gonna have a different impact on how ISAP rolls out there too. Some are better than others. I'm not gonna deny that. But nonetheless, with this common core, the 4 pillars and the communication, the pieces off of it, is we should be able to go in from one room to the next room, be able to have those conversations with consistency, have an understanding with consistency as we go forward with it. Some of the other pieces that a lot of the team, the ISAP process is looking at is like, improving the process. Like we want to make it better. They want to make it better. Everybody wants to see it improve as we're kind of going through. So these interlock pieces, as you come through them, is we want to be able to have the conversation on what can we do better next time to improve those. I'm just kind of catching up on the chat here a little bit. Yeah, Darren, that's a good point. The documentation off of those decisions, off of not making the decision. Yeah, absolutely. Like that's a good place. That's a good point off of it, off of that essay for sure. Looking at even a little bit further up, from Ryan from group 2 there is, yeah, that common definition really is the key. Like if we're talking, this is an apple and you're looking at an orange, we're both talking fruity, but we're not on the same page. It's definitely important to get those definitions, those pieces out there. All right, well, how do we know if it's being used effectively? I mean, this is back to kind of some closeouts and some AARs and everything else. But essentially, if these 4 pieces, these 4 pillars are being communicated down to the levels they need to be communicated at the appropriate levels, then we know that it's being effective. In one regard or the other, the process is being effective. If that means that AAs are getting a value out of it for being able to communicate their values of risk, as well as our responders know that there's a hazard with that essay that we're looking at. Again, that's where the success is. That's where we know that it's being used effectively as that communication tool. That kind of takes me to the end of it a little bit there, and I do want to just cap this off by saying that like I'm not the expert inside our RMOs. I'm not the expert on ISAP. This is the process as I understand it, and having been in a number of these meetings and seen a number of them go out, that's a real big overview. But I would like to toss it back and say, if you do have the opportunity to go in and be a fly on the wall for some of these conversations for AAs and aspiring ICs, do that, because this process isn't really going anywhere. It's going to continue to be embedded and it's going to continue to be improved as we move forward. But it's important to kind of understand how that goes so that we're given the best probability of success for our folks in the safest manner that we can possibly provide. So I'm going to open it up right there for coaches, for anybody else that has any questions that we can possibly answer off of the off of that ISAP presentation. Ooh, I'm not seeing a whole lot. All right. Well, are there any larger questions that are noodling on your mind from the material that I covered today? Anything that I can help clarify? And Brian, I appreciate you putting that link in there to that ISAP video, that story map. That's a good read if you guys get a couple minutes. So as a matter of fact, that's the end of my material, my presentation. So what I'm going to encourage you all to do, bring Eric back on. Eric, what time do you need him back?
We're going to take a 10-minute break, so be back at 40 after.
Okay, and I would encourage everybody to go look at that YouTube video during your break also, and just kind of look at what some of the dialogue Brad had on the probability of success. It was a pretty succinct video that will help a little bit more understanding. So thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Heath.
Thanks.